Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going basically as far back as I possibly can with coverage and actual deck profiles and taking a look at the 2003 World Championship, the very first Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship, and taking a look at what you may call Yata lock or hand control or hand destruction, a strategy that was very popular after the release of Yata, combining some of the most powerful hand disruption cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history. This is a format before a forbidden list. There was a limitation to certain cards, but this was before any card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Was actually forbidden. That wouldn't take place until the year after. And at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history, we're going to be able to play with a suite of some of the most classic cards. Raigeki, Harpy's Feather Duster, Pot of Greed, all of these classic cards, some of which have actually come off the ban list in modern sense, like Harpy's, Raigeki, Dark Hole, and others. But taking a look at the way Yu-Gi-Oh! Was essentially when I first started playing. I opened Tournament Pack 1 going back basically 20 years from now. I remember showing up to my local at Batters Up in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, right at the dawn of Yu-Gi-Oh! And having the opportunity to play with some of these cards. And talking about these particular decks and profiling these particular strategies is really so meaningful to me because I'm talking about these cards, I'm thinking about them, I have that modern lens where I'm starting to think, what would I have done differently if I, instead of being that 10-year-old showing up with, whatever cards I own that were foil, versus where I am now, past 30, thinking about, with 20 years of Yu-Gi-Oh! Experience, how a modernized view of this particular format would have looked. It's really been a pretty exciting thing to go back and think about. But we're going to look at what Yu-Gi-Oh! Was like in 2003. I'm going to avoid too much tinkering. I'm going to kind of profile the first place at the 2003 World Championship, talk about some of these deck choices, and try and keep it as authentic as possible, right? This is a Yu-Gi-Oh! History channel, and I will make tweaks here or there in some decks, but I really think it's valuable to look at some of the insights that people had going back 20 years and think about what they were considering when building and constructing some of their decks. Today, though, we're going to look at one of the more popular early Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies, especially when Yata was released, which is to rid your opponent of as many cards in their hand as possible through drop-off, the Forceful Sentry, Delinquent Duo, and Confiscation, in addition to monsters like Donzaluk and potentially Spirit Reaper, not necessarily in this profile per se, but many strategies utilize Spirit Reaper. And when you combine those strategies together, you're trying to rip the cards out of your opponent's hand and then Yata lock them. If you're not familiar with Yata, if it deals damage, your opponent skips their next draw phase. Theoretically, that is a win condition in and of its own, because if there's no card in your opponent's hand that actually can do anything to counteract Yata attacking for 200 every turn will eventually game them, and if that is not enough in actual damage, you add a Premature Burial, you add a Call of the Haunted, a Monster Reborn, you just put a second monster on the field, and that will assuredly win the game. Yata could steal a game out of nowhere, and when you actually try to filter through your deck as fast as possible with cards like Mirage of Nightmare, Pot of Greed, Dress of Charity, and then you try and disrupt your opponent with the cards that I alluded to earlier, in addition to sort of the holistic strategy that you have going on here with the removal. You're really trying to rid your opponent's resources, disrupt any of the playable cards in their hand, and then kill them with Yata. This particular deck would have to play against a lot of interesting strategies. People used to call it beatdown back in the day. The deck that I'm profiling today will actually include Gemini Elves, going all the way back to one of the earliest classic cards. But there are some strategies that went even heavier into the beatdown strategy. Not today, but decks had cards like Spear Dragon and Goblin Attack Force, Injection Fairy Lily, basically trying to maximize damage output on singular monsters. There's some really cool old school strategies that centered around tribute monsters, and I'm not talking about monarchs. I'm talking about Dark Ruler Hades and Guardian Sphinx, Air Knight Parshath, Jinzo. Some really cool classic cards, and going back to my childhood, I can just vividly remember playing with some of these cards, chasing some of these cards in trades, playing against some of these cards. It's really exciting to finally go back and profile Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically the way it was when I first started 20 years ago. But nevertheless, let's take a deep dive look at the summer 2003 and specifically take a look at the first place deck from the 2003 Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship.
All right, we'll start off with the only tribute monster in the deck, which is a single copy of Jinzo. We are at a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where people basically consider Jinzo a borderline staple, even though if we go back and revamp some old school decks, Jinzo would be one of the cards that a lot of people would cut. It can be difficult to deal with. There are cards like Dark Hole, Raigeki. There are cards like Snatch Steal and Change of Hearts. It's not impossible to do with Jinzo. It does also give us a little bit of a combo with Change of Heart and Snatch Steal, and you can use Call the Haunted to basically do a pseudo trap stun effect. So there are some synergies in the deck. Probably would still be included if we went back and tried to revamp these strategies. But there's a single copy of Jinzo, and then the largest attack strength that we have out of a monster that doesn't have an obvious drawback is Gemini Elf. So Gemini Elf has 1900 attack, and it has no effect. It outclasses Mechanical Chaser, which prior to Gemini Elf was the highest attack threshold. This format, you're going to be playing against a bunch of other people with Gemini Elves, a bunch of beatdown strategies. You also just need a monster to deal damage yourself. I mean, I think if we go back and play this format and revamp these strategies, we probably cut the vanilla monsters. But I think one of the coolest aspects of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that we actually had space for these old school vanilla monsters that are just played because of their attack threshold. And I've never been able to profile a deck with Gemini Elf, so I think it's really cool to showcase Gemini Elf. It's one of my favorite cards of all time. I remember it being a chase card back in the day. And it kind of fits that sort of fantasy dynamic of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where it almost looks like it's a Magic the Gathering card with its artwork. It doesn't necessarily line up all the time with other cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! But it's just one of those cards that is so historic, and I'm really excited to finally profile a deck with them. But those are 3 copies of Gemini Elf, and then 3 copies of Mystic Tomato. Mystic Tomato is really important because it can tutor Sangin and Witch of the Black Forest, both of which are integral in this deck strategy, which is trying to access Yata as quickly as possible. They both also tutor Don Zalug. This is one of the cards that, as a kid, I'll be completely honest, I did not understand why it was good. Back when I was, 10 years old playing with these cards, I didn't understand why picking off cards from your opponent's hand was so valuable. I was one of those kids that at 10 years old didn't understand one card in hand is worth infinitely more than 2 cards off the top of the deck. Everybody was hitting the hand, and I was thinking to myself, why don't you just want to destroy 2 cards off the top of the deck? I think a lot of young players had that mindset. But, now with, 15, 20 years later with experience in the game, it totally makes sense why a card like Don Zalug is included in the deck. It's a dark monster off of Mystic Tomato. It also, of course, combines Mystic Tomato with Sangin and Witch of the Black Forest, which basically gives us access to 2 parts of our strategy, which is tutor out Yata so that we can Yata lock our opponent, or tutor out Don Zalug so that we can pick off cards in their hand, combine it with the other hand destruction cards, and then eventually Yata lock our opponent. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, we have Witch and Sangin. Typically, we are just tutoring out either Sinister Serpent if we really want it, or Yata if we don't have it. Witch has a little bit more flexibility. We can actually tutor out some of the beat stick monsters. You can tutor out Jinzo or Gemini Elf if necessary. So Witch has a little bit more flexibility in that sense, but they're both really important. We have a single copy of Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer. We can actually tutor this out off Witch, so thinking about it that way, we sort of have almost 4 copies because we have the 3 tomatoes, the Witch, and the Kaiku to get access to it. We're at a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where the Chaos Monsters had yet to be released, so it might seem a little bit odd to include this, but it's one of the cards that allows us to deal with our opponent's Sinister Serpent. If we are trying to Yata lock our opponent, Sinister Serpent is one of the ways that you can circumvent that, where if your opponent just has Yata and no other monsters, and they have to just normal summon Yata, attack, and then bounce it back to hand and pass with no monsters, if the opponent has Sinister Serpent, then they can just add it back to their hand and set it, even though they skip a draw phase. The 250 defense is enough to wall up against Yata, and obviously Yata needs to hit directly anyway. As a result, this gives us a little bit of counterplay to your opponent's Sinister Serpent. We have Magician of Faith. There's so many power spells in this format. You'll see why recurring the power spells makes a ton of sense. We have a single copy of Fiber Jar. Fiber Jar is an interesting one. It's the reset button. This card's been basically banned for almost all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. When it flips, you basically just reshuffle the deck and the graveyard and the hands together, and then you draw 5 new cards, both players. The banish pile technically stays there, but this format you're not really banishing a lot. Besides, I guess, with Kaiku and maybe Bazoo the Soul Eater, which was legal at the time as well. No Chaos Monsters, nothing like that. But it gives us a counterplay to Yata lock, right? If we're getting Yata locked, or our hand has been ripped apart by whether it's Forceful Sentry, Confiscation, and all the other cards that this deck runs, you can eventually just set a Fiber Jar and then reset the game. And technically, depending on the way you want to look at this, you are the one that gets the advantage if your opponent attacks into this, because if both players draw to 5, assuming the opponent didn't draw any Hand Disruption, Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, those type of effects, if you both have 5 cards, you are technically going to be the first person to see a draw phase and get up to 6. Now, granted, it's not quite that clean because there are so many power spells that can disrupt the opponent's hand, so it's not obviously that clear. But it does theoretically reset the game enough to a point where you'll be able to potentially make a comeback if you've been hand disrupted. And then, of course, there is the win condition in many of the games, such as Yata Garasu. With cards like Dark Hole, Regeki, Snatch Steal, it's pretty easy to clear the field. And then with all the hand disruption from the Don Zalug to the cards we're going to talk about in just a moment in the spell, and then even trap lineup, we are trying to get Yata Garasu to resolve as much as possible and basically just lock the opponent out from ever being able to play. But that is our monster lineup. Our spell lineup, we have 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon. It might seem weird to include 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon. There are a couple of reasons why people play Triple Space Typhoon. One, it's a counter to Imperial Order, right? Your opponent flips Imperial Order when you activate any power spell. You can just chain MST from your hand and destroy the Imperial Order, or from your back row if necessary. This is a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where it's the original, pre-errata of all of these cards, let alone Imperial Order. So the opponent could just choose not to use Imperial Order, right? They can just send it to the graveyard whenever they want. We don't really want to give them that flexibility of locking you out of spells for as long as they want. So by using triple MST, when your opponent has Imperial Order, you can just chain it, destroy it, resolve your spell, and then carry on the game as you wanted. Then we have 2 other back row destruction cards, Harpy's Feather Duster and Heavy Storm. They are both, at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, limited to 1. What's interesting is there's actually not an exorbitant amount of power trap cards that people played. I mean, there's Ring, there's Mirror Force. I'll talk about them in momentarily. But a lot of cards people played were actually chainable. It is important, though, because there were some gravity bind, sort of beat down, slow strategies where having these type of back row destruction cards were pretty important. So it makes sense. We're also trying to attack with Yata. We don't want to attack our Yata into Mirror Force. We have Dark Hole and Regeki, 2 ways of clearing the field so that our Yata can attack directly. They're both limited to 1. Some of the original power cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Then we have, let's do these 2 because they're kind of similar to each other. Monster Reborn and Premature Burial, right? It's just 2 power spells, right? The limited list at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history is pretty long. And almost every card in this deck is a limited card. For example, Pot of Greed is on the limited list. Obviously, we're going to play Pot of Greed. Graceful Charity is on the limited list. Obviously, we're going to play Graceful Charity. Mirage of Nightmare is on the limited list. For those of you who don't know how this card works, because you didn't play 20 years ago, it's actually one of the cooler cards in this particular deck. So when you activate Mirage of Nightmare during your opponent's standby phase, you draw until you have 4 cards in your hand. So if you have no hand and you have this card face up, on your opponent's standby phase, you just draw 4 cards. So you just drew 4 cards off of 1. The problem is you then need to randomly discard the same quantity of cards that you drew during your standby phase. One of the other reasons why we play triple Mystical Space Typhoon is we eventually will draw into Mystical Space Typhoon, and then what it allows us to do is when we have Mystical Space Typhoon, we can just use it as a quick play and destroy our Mirage of Nightmare, and then not have to do the discard. So if you have these 2 cards, you can set this card, to set an MST. During your opponent's standby phase, you draw 4, so now your Mirage of Nightmare just went +3. Then you use your 1 MST, so now you go from a +3 to a +2 because you traded MST and Mirage of Nightmare for 4 fresh new cards. And the cool thing about it is you can actually just draw into MST because it's a quick play. So for example, if you didn't already have MST, you draw 4 cards. Let's see, one of the 4 cards you draw is an MST. On your turn, you draw to 5, and then you just use the quick play from your hand on the Mirage of Nightmare. And then you have 4 fresh cards in your hand. You just use the MST that you drew on the Mirage of Nightmare. Because you have triple MST in your deck, you're eventually going to draw into it, and it makes Mirage of Nightmare completely free, right? There's almost no liability with using Mirage of Nightmare. And if you don't draw MST, maybe you hit a Sinister Serpent and you can add it back to your hand. Maybe you fuel your graveyard for Monster Reborn, Call the Haunted, stuff like that. So even if you don't draw one of 3 MSTs, there's a lot of reason to use this combo. Other great power spells. So these are our draw engine power spells. And then our hand disruption, we have a Delinquent Duo, right? We're trying to Yata lock our opponent. Hitting 2 cards is awesome. A Forceful Sentry is incredible. It gets us the ability to pick off Sinister Serpent, which is not something the Confiscation can do, but it allows us to pick off Sinister Serpent, put it back into the deck so we don't have to worry about it at all. Then we Yata lock the opponent and the game is over. So we have 3 hand disruption and 3 draw power cards. We have a single copy of No Limit Crossout. You technically could play more than 1 copy of No Limit Crossout, but as it might seem, this deck doesn't necessarily need to set a ton, so I can understand only playing 1, especially with all the beatdown strategies with Goblin Attack Force that you have to worry about. And then a Change of Heart and a Snatch Steal, again, 2 power cards. We have at least 1 single tribute monster, so that if we take our opponent's monster with something like Change of Heart, we can just tribute it away. There's also cards in the format like Spirit Reaper that we want to kill, and we can take cards like Donzalug and attack, and then hit cards out of the opponent's hand. So even if we have to give it back off something like Change of Heart, we can sometimes at least take a card out of their hand along the way. And it also, with Snatch Steal, gives us a way to just go, Snatch Steal plus Yata and win the game that way. Granted, they're going to gain the 1,000 life every turn, but if they can't draw and they don't have any way of dealing with this, eventually you're going to draw Reborn or Premature Burial, and then it doesn't matter. The trap lineup has 3 copies of Drop Off. Another reason I was really excited to profile this deck is I've never really been able to profile Drop Off, and I think it's a really cool card. Really simple. You activate it in your opponent's draw phase, they discard the card they drew. Hopefully it's not either Electric Snake if it's in game 2 or 3, and hopefully it's not Sinister Serpent. But besides that, it's one of those ways where if you know your opponent's hand and you've hand disrupted them with Confiscation and Forceful Sentry, you've ripped cards out of their hand with Donzalug, it's one of the ways to make it so they're basically in that vice grip where they never get out of it. And if you're trying to Yata lock them, it makes a lot of sense. We have a single copy of Imperial Order. It is obviously limited to 1. There's so many spells in this deck. And again, this is pre-errata. This is, 15 years probably before the errata. So you get to choose when to shut it off, which is enormous in this particular strategy. We have Mirror Force, Call of the Haunted, and then a Ring of Destruction, bringing this particular deck list up to 41 cards. In terms of what you would anticipate playing against at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, so we commented on beatdown strategies while profiling this deck and talked about how Gemini Elf was the highest attack threshold. There were actually some decks that went really hardcore, and in addition to Gemini Elf, played Goblin Attack Force and had 2 pretty reasonably sized beatdown monsters, so you'd have just 6 quote-unquote beatdown monsters. There were even versions of this deck that went so far to play Mechanical Chaser, which is outclassed by Gemini Elf, but if you need to go even further down, you want to play a 4th, 5th, and 6th vanilla monster, there is a Mechanical Chaser as well, so there's the sort of beatdown strategy. There's some sort of warrior strategies. There are 2 reinforcements of the army in the format. There's, Goblin Attack Force, Exiled Force. We don't quite have cards like DD Warrior Lady yet, but we do have cards like, as I just alluded to, those couple. And a lot of the, beatdown monsters like Goblin Attack Force of Warriors plus Exile Force allows you to tutor out a removal card. So there are some interesting, combinations there. Unfortunately, Exile Force is limited to 1, so it's not like you can just tutor out a bunch of them. But there's enough reasonable warriors at this point in time. Donzalug, too, is another good warrior that you could tutor out. There's the Hand Disruption sort of mirror match. There's last turn OTK decks. When you combine last turn with the Jowgen, you could win the game out of nowhere. That's, one of the potent OTK strategies from the early stages of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. If you activate last turn with Jowgen on the field, right, if you've been able to kind of facilitate that, you just outright win the game, right? Your opponent can't do anything. Then we have, I put a Dark Ruler Hades here. There's some sort of big monster decks with Guardian Sphinx and Dark Ruler Hades. If you played back in the day, these are some of the really frustrating tribute monsters that existed. You could technically just play Summon Skull and outclass them all. But assuming you don't want to play Summon Skull, there were definitely some control strategies that tried to tribute summon. There's Jinzo that was almost considered a staple as a tribute, but there were some pretty interesting tributes. Guardian Sphinx and Dark Ruler Hades with the other 2. If you've been playing modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And modern retro Yu-Gi-Oh! I should say, and are familiar with Revived King Hades, this is basically just that effect on a tribute monster, which back in the day was pretty potent, right? If your opponent has this big 2450 and you have no way of killing it, you can't really set Mystic Tomato and stall the game out. Eventually you're just going to lose because this monster negates those effects. So it's really frustrating to play against. This is the exact side deck from the first place winner of the 2003 Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship. So we'll see how it lines up into these strategies. First, for the mirror match, we have 3 copies of Electric Snake. Basically, when Electric Snake is discarded by the opponent's card effect, you get to draw 2 cards. So if they Delinquent Duo you draw 2 cards. It hits a drop-off, you draw 2 cards. They randomly hit it with Spirit Reaper or Donzalug, you draw 2 cards. Obviously, they're not going to choose it with Confiscation, and Forceful Sentry doesn't discard, but there are plenty of discard outlets the opponent has, and this card completely negates their total game plan. So it's a really difficult card to play around when you're playing this particular strategy. But 3 copies of Electric Snake, you think you're at a point where you're about to win the game because you're about to Yata lock them, and then you hit this out of their hand, now they draw 2 new cards, and it's like, oh man, I don't know if the Yata lock's going to work. 1 copy of Airnight Parshaft, I don't necessarily have a specific reason why this was included in the deck per se. It is one of the more popular cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's early history. I think it would line up better against non-beatdown strategies. The fact that Gemini Elf can just crash into it's really frustrating. So there are some slower strategies where this card might line up pretty well. There's a single copy of Kaiku to give us an additional out to Sinister Serpent, so that when we do try to Yata lock our opponent, we have some resistance to that. A single copy of Exiled Force. Exiled Force is one of your outs to Dark Ruler Hades, right? You can just side deck in the Exiled Force and just destroy the Dark Ruler. So it does give us an out to that. There are also some of those strategies, like I commented on earlier, that play something like Guardian Sphinx. And if you get into the Guardian Sphinx lock, if you're not familiar with Guardian Sphinx, it's basically a tribute monster. And when you flip it, it bounces all your opponent's monsters to the hand, and then you can set it face down. It's one of the, people might refer to it as a Pac-Man monster, like Swarm of Scarabs, Swarm of Locusts. It's just a tribute monster. That lock can be really difficult to deal with. So having a card like Exile Force that can out that, but then also Dark Ruler gives us some resistance against those sort of big tribute monster strategies. We have a white magical hat, which might seem interesting because it's a strictly weaker version of Donzalug because it has worse attack and defense, but it's only a level 3, and there are actually some gravity bind strategies at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So having a way of actually still picking off cards from your opponent's hand that can attack under gravity bind made a little bit of sense. I'm not sure I would do it, but that is partially one of the reasons why it would be there. 3 copies of Book of Moon, just a generically good card. It can set some of the beatdown monsters, and then you can attack over them yourself, right? If you Book of Moon a Gemini Elf and you attack over it with Gemini Elf, now your opponent can either use their Goblin Attack Force, which then would cause it to shift to defense to attack over, or crash with their Gemini Elf. So there's some reasonable play there with Book of Moon. We have a single copy of Scapegoat, so it lines up pretty well against some of those beatdown strategies. A card that you're going to see and you might think, why are you not playing this card in the main deck? So Painful Choice really took off once Chaos Monsters came out. At this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, you would use Painful Choice to send Sinister Serpent, and then 4 cards you either don't want to draw, or 4 cards that you either want a Monster Born, Premature Burial, Call, Haunted, or Magician of Faith back. Why we would actually side deck that in this particular format is it allows us to basically play an additional copy of Sinister Serpent, and if we're playing into the mirror match and they try to Yata lock us, we can ditch all the cards that we don't necessarily want, but in addition to that, we can put Sinister either in the graveyard or theoretically in our hand, because they're always going to pick Sinister Serpent, and then we have resistance to not only the Yata lock, but also cards like Donzalug and Delinquent Duo. Then we have 3 copies of Torrential Tribute, which again is at 3. Pretty cool that this card is at 3. Torrential Tribute lines up really well against the beatdown strategies, right? If we're trying to survive against Mechanical Chaser, Goblin Attack, or Spear Dragon, that's a card I haven't mentioned, which was a really cool old school card. And cards like Gemini Elf, being able to clear them with Torrential Tribute makes a lot of sense. But nevertheless, this is our first look going all the way back to some of the older Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats. I'm really excited to start profiling some of these old strategies. But that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.